The Buffalo Niagara region is experiencing an amazing renaissance, building a future based in a lot of ways on our past. It's a past full of some great characters and great stories, the building blocks of the unknown stories of Western New York. And now we take a look behind the scenes at some of the vast collection of the Buffalo History Museum, and in particular, how they were able to solve an unknown story surrounding an entire building that was donated. It's quite a collection, but what you may not realize is that at any given time, there is less than 10% of the History Museum's overall collection on display. The figurative tip of the iceberg. So where is the bulk of the berg? It's here on Forest Avenue, the Buffalo History Museum's Resource Center. From muskets to memorabilia and everything in between. There's even an entire building in the collection.
You know, outside of our responsibility to share the collection and provide access to it, we also have to preserve it.
This little building has lived many lives, from garden shed to playhouse, but those lives were secondary to its place in Buffalo history.
Ann Werner from West Seneca, which was Gardenville at the time of the Pan Am, reached out and said, look, you know, I think I have a building from the Pan American Exposition.
That phone call came into the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society in the spring of 1998. Current President Melissa Brown had just been hired by the museum to work on the Pan Am Exposition commemoration. So she was eager to find out the hidden history behind this potential donation. She first looked into the property where the building had spent the better part of a century. She found that there was a connection to one of the biggest Pan Am sponsors, the Simon Brewery.
They knew that the Simon family lived in that home. It was their summer home. So I knew the Simons had a display at the exposition. I knew they were really involved. So that held water. The building was not sitting on like a set foundation. So it did look like it had been moved, maybe. That also seemed plausible. So I went back to the archives and I was able to find an image of it.
This image of it sitting inside the West Amherst Street gate. So they had a sighting. The next question was, what was it? Ann Werner thought it might have been a ticket booth, but the exact purpose remained a mystery until about 10 years ago when another picture was found revealing the secret.
It was a souvenir concession. They sold commemorative Pan Am coins out of this little building.
So now the site and the purpose of the building was found. Next came restoring it. Luckily, Mrs. Werner's daughter was an experienced preservation architect, so she did the legwork and the research on what needed to be done and even sourced the proper materials, such as the roof tiles and the paint colors.
It was important to her and her daughter's story of growing up. They wanted to see, you know, the building preserved, and so it's a great little piece of the Pan Am that we still have.
And one other great chapter connects that ornate banister that you just saw in the History Museum collection to the American Express credit card that you may have in your wallet right now. Fargo, a Buffalo street, half of a well-known name in business and finances, and Buffalo's 27th mayor. Yep, they're all the same guy, William G. Fargo.
He served as mayor of Buffalo from 1861 to 1867, and then started this project, this elaborate over 22,000 square foot mansion.
William Fargo came to Buffalo to work for the Auburn-Syracuse Railroad, and he would soon meet Henry Wells. The two went into business for themselves, forming the Western Express Company, which became American Express. He also started Wells Fargo to offer delivery services to the new Western frontier. The Stagecoach, the Pony Express, both creations of Wells Fargo, as was a 22,170 square foot mansion, which covered 5.5 acres, land which is now occupied by homes and streets from Porter Avenue south beyond Pennsylvania, Fargo, Jersey, many of the streets that make up today's West Side. This historic marker sits near the corner of Fargo and Jersey to remind us of this neighborhood's proud past.
This was an iconic project. People were very well aware that was happening. They were very well aware of his wealth, the exuberance of this mansion. I mean, just by the scale of it, when you think about a home that's 22,000 square feet, this is the newel post from the home.
Just one of the Fargo relics in the collection of the Buffalo History Museum. The 22,170 square foot mansion was completed in 1872 at a cost of $600,000, the equivalent of $15 million today.
Gives me pause is to think, so he builds this, he's alive for less than a decade after that. He dies, and then his wife dies like 2 years later in 1890, and then within 10 years the home is in such disrepair, no one could take it on. It was so big they couldn't sell it, and it's demolished.
By 1901, the estate, which covered a full city block, was subdivided into this West Side neighborhood, leaving behind just this historic marker, a few pieces of the collection at the History Museum, and another chapter in the unknown stories of Western New York. And the west side of Buffalo is also home to some of the earliest immigrants of Italy and Sicily, something you can trace for yourself in the Centro Culturale Italiano di Buffalo. Italian immigrants began to gain a foothold in Buffalo by the late 1800s. In fact, by 1900, their numbers had reached 6,000, despite finding a less than welcoming community.
All of the barriers that they would have faced and the discrimination on top of it is just almost unfathomable.
This interactive map at the Italian Cultural Center shows the areas where people from different regions settled, sticking together in this new land. The Upper East Side had a population from the Abruzzi region. The Lower East Side, including Lovejoy, was the Capabasi region. And in South Buffalo, there was a group from the southern Italian region of Calabria. In downtown, there was a neighborhood full of immigrants from Naples. But the largest populations were from Sicily on the Lower West Side, in a neighborhood known then as the Hooks. It's what we now enjoy as Canal Side. In 1909, Canal Street was actually renamed Dante Place.
It was considered easily one of the roughest places in Buffalo. It had a bit of a reputation even nationally for how crime-ridden it was.
Crime-ridden and overcrowded.
The tenements were notorious for overcrowding, so a lot of the buildings that maybe were designed to accommodate, 100 families would have upwards of 1,000 people living in them.
Cultural Center Executive Director Lindsay Lauren Visser walked me through their History Museum, which includes a display focused on Dante Place and the tenements. It includes impressive artifacts like these keys from an actual Dante Place apartment dropped off by a visitor. But the most impactful part is the layout itself.
To help you visualize what exactly a tenement room would have been like, the distance between this wall and this wall is exactly 10 feet, and the distance between this wall and this wall is exactly 10 feet, which was actually the average size of a tenement room.
Dante Place existed until the 1950s, when it was replaced by what we now know as Marine Drive. And because we're only talking about a period that existed a couple of generations ago, it's an exhibit that hits home with a lot of visitors.
I can't even tell you the number of times that people will look at a picture and be like, oh, so-and-so lived there, or that's my cousin, or something like that, because the Italian community in Buffalo is so close-knit that people do see these things. And so for a lot of people, it's a very, very personal experience coming in and seeing their ancestors on the walls. And then for others, it's so powerful because it reminds them of something that's so familiar to them.
And as you walk through, the thing that hits you is the fact that this population of new Americans, like so many other ethnic groups that came before and after, was able to fight through adversity and climb the rungs of the American dream.
It really makes you appreciate how hard they worked and what they had to do to get to that point.
Up next on the Unknown Stories of Western New York, from the birth of the burger to the birth of the Lone Ranger, how Western New York gave the world these little pieces of Americana. Welcome back to the Unknown Stories. Well, we begin this segment with a salute to that culinary favorite, a little bit of Americana that began right here in Western New York long ago at the Erie County Fair. For author and historian Chris Carosa, the Erie County Fair holds a special place in his heart.
This is my grandfather here, and I worked in this stand. It was right outside what was then the main gate.
This pizza stand was his home for 12 days every summer.
I worked here for 10 years, more than 10 years, grew up in Blaisdell, went to schools here, had friends here, never heard the story.
The story, a culinary caper that traces the birth of the burger right here to the heart of Hamburg. A story that he didn't know until he was a student at Yale, researching a paper on the history of his hometown. He found an 1885 newspaper circular in the Yale Library telling the tale of the Menches brothers' on-the-spot innovation.
They ran out of pork sausage. They went to the butcher. The butcher said, hey, I'm not going to slaughter a whole pig for 10 pounds. You're going to have to settle for something else.
That something else was ground beef that they shaped into the same type of patties as the sausage they'd been slinging.
And because of the way it cooked, they burned the outside and the inside was raw. So they didn't create the first hamburger, they created the first hockey puck.
So back to the drawing board, and believe it or not, they added a little coffee to the mix.
And that way it'll steam the inside so it cooked all the way through. So that's how they cooked it, and the coffee tasted lousy, so they added brown sugar and some other ingredients. Sold out.
An instant hit.
Some guy comes up to him and says, hey, what do you call this? Well, they just invented it. They didn't have a name. And what do we call the Erie County Fair? People who live here, we call it the Hamburg Fair. And there's signs all over, Hamburg Fair. So Frank looks up at the Hamburg Fair sign and says, hey, it's called a Hamburg sandwich.
And the rest is history. A much debated history at that, and a history that Chris dove headfirst into as he wrote his book, Hamburger Dreams.
Well, what I did in my research is I went to old newspaper articles to find out the first mention of either a hamburger or Hamburg sandwich. And the earliest mention I was able to find was 1893. So any story that had an origin after that was obviously wrong. So that kicked out New Haven, it kicked out St. Louis, it kicked out Texas, really only left Wisconsin and Hamburg, New York.
Using the same research techniques that he used in his studies at Yale, he reached his conclusion.
The way I determined which one won, so to speak, was which fair occurred first. Well, Hamburg beat Wisconsin by about a month.
And today, 138 years later, burger lovers everywhere are the real winners. And now the story of yet another author diving into the origins of an American classic that was also born here in Buffalo. Frank Stryker was born and raised in Buffalo, went to UB, and got his first radio job at WEBR Radio.
I don't know where I heard about Frank Stryker, but when I did, I was amazed that I never heard of him before.
When he was at EBR, Stryker became an announcer and writer. One of the most famous characters of all time actually flowed from his brain through his typewriter and then out over the air. That legendary character was the Lone Ranger.
I really got interested about this person who had such an impact on 20th century pop culture that has sort of been forgotten over the years.
So interested that author Stephen Iowano has made him the principal subject and focus of his latest Buffalo-based novel, Yesteryear.
The basic timeline is sort of true. I condensed it a little bit for Fran's story. The basic elements of his life are true. And then I just started thinking about Buffalo at that period. What would it have been like? And that's when I pulled in real-life characters like The Undertaker, the mob boss out of Niagara Falls, and Jimmy Slattery, and said, I don't know if they intersected, but they could have.
In fact, at the beginning of the book, Stryker has dealings with Stefano Magaddino, the infamous mob boss, and crosses paths with Jimmy Slattery, the former light heavyweight champ, in a location familiar to many, the bar at Volker's Bowling Alley. That was within walking distance of the real Stryker's home on Granger Place in North Buffalo. And that's also a point where fact and fiction go hand in hand.
And legend has it he had two offices, one at his house on Granger Place, and the other one at his mother-in-law's house. So when he got too annoying to his family and his neighbor with a constant typing at one house, he'd go and work at the other one.
That's another facet of Stryker's life that Iowano captures in Yesteryear, the fact that Stryker was a prolific writer, but also a workaholic who in the end put family first, especially when he took a job in Detroit to support his family during the Great Depression, even though it meant he would later give up the rights to the shows he created, including the legendary characters, the Lone Ranger and Green Hornet. And this year, we celebrate Stryker and the birth of that mysterious masked man.
This is the 90th anniversary of when the Ranger first rode into our homes.
And about a quarter century before that mighty hi-ho silver, water began flowing from the Emerald Channel through a wonder of architecture and engineering that Patrick Hammer and I got to see firsthand. For 108 years, this is how Buffalo's gotten its water, a grand feat of engineering and a shell of waterfront history. But what came before it? Well, there's another bit of history in plain sight, and a big example of necessity being the mother of invention.
After a rain event, you can drive down the 190 and you can see the mud line from the Buffalo River. That mud line you can see at times approaches that intake. So that contaminated water ended up going to everyone. And that's what created a typhoid epidemic at the time. And someone decided, hey, and that's when the colonel stepped in. And from that point forward, they've nailed it.
We start just a bit downriver from the Colonel Ward, and a relic that is easy to mistake as a stuck barge or a sunken ship right under the Peace Bridge. But it's actually an old water intake built in the early 1850s, and it supplied Buffalo for a half century. This too was a feat of engineering. The water was taken in here in the river, then pumped by 2 high-pressure steam engines through a 330-foot tunnel under the Erie Canal and up to street level, ultimately filling the Prospect Hill Reservoir, a 13 million gallon reserve overlooking the public square, which is now Prospect and Columbus Parks. The reservoir actually sat where the Connecticut Street Armory stands today. Before the reservoir, the village of Black Rock also had its own water system. It was spring-fed, evidence of which you can still see today.
In Forest Lawn Cemetery, there's the pond that the spring feeds to this day. It has the stairs going down into it.
On Niagara Street, there's this historic marker in front of the Jubilee Library, which was paid for through the sale of the Jubilee Waterworks land. Scott Glasgow of the Black Rock Historic Society says that even after the reservoir system came about, many people still swore by Jubilee spring water.
It was supposed to be superior. There's many accounts of it being much superior to Buffalo's water. They would talk about the medicinal properties.
The original spring house stood at the corner of Auburn and Delaware Avenue.
It was just gravity. There was a 20-foot difference in elevation from here to Delaware and Auburn, so it was just gravity fed through logs, hollowed out logs.
It flowed through Black Rock through a series of underground wooden pipes.
They had hydrants on each corner in the neighborhood here, and you could just, go and pump your own water and bring it in.
The system was acquired by the city of Buffalo after it annexed the village of Black Rock in 1853 and ultimately abandoned in 1898. By that time, the city had already built a bigger reservoir at Jefferson and Best, built in 1893. It operated until 1937, when the facility was replaced by the old rock pile. Up next on the Unknown Stories, a couple of Queen City presidential visits, one to dedicate a school, the other as our nation stood on the brink of nuclear war. Welcome back. Well, the Queen City's presidential history goes back a long time. Millard Fillmore, Grover Cleveland, and the list of presidential visits is long. In Tonawanda, one visit was quite special, as a former president came to town to help dedicate a building bearing his name. As dirt moves at Hoover Middle School in the Kenton District, we take a look back 72 years to when construction equipment was putting the finishing touches on the brand new Hoover Elementary, and the very special day it was dedicated.
Wow, this is really cool, and I don't ever remember hearing about this at all.
Tonawanda Historical Society President Judy Tucker pages through the photo album of that day of celebration. So that's your favorite?
Yeah.
Why?
I don't know, just to me, it exemplifies a different time.
Dedication Day, October 10th, 1951.
It was quite pomp and circumstance, I guess is the best way to put it.
It isn't every day that you have the namesake at the school dedication, not to mention a former United States president. That's right, our 31st president, Herbert Hoover, not only attended, but also spoke at the dedication.
He talked about schools and how important it was to elevate, people's learning.
18 years had passed since Hoover occupied the White House during a very turbulent time in U.S. history. And Tucker points out that in the former president's mind, this honor may have been one step in changing his legacy.
Hoover was like the Depression president. So this was like a great way for him to bring a new persona to the public. And he was very, very pleased to have this building dedicated in his honor.
And 11 years and 4 days later, another president came to town. He took part in a parade, addressed a massive crowd in the front of City Hall. But what we didn't know at the time was that the world was on the brink of nuclear war.
He comes on that day, and Buffalo basically went out of its mind.
President Kennedy arrived to throngs of people, even riding down Broadway in the annual Pulaski Day Parade. Phyllis Reese was there with her husband and their 8mm camera.
When he was coming, I thought, oh no, I'm going to get the back of his head. He's not going to turn around, and sure enough, he did. So we got a lovely shot.
Newspaper accounts from the day estimate that 400,000 people turned out along the parade route and to hear him speak in Niagara Square.
It must have been incredibly exciting at the time that your president was right there.
We pay tribute to Pulaski today.
It was an exciting day on the surface, but behind the scenes, a day that marked the start of a Cold War standoff between two superpowers. An American U-2 spy plane making a high-altitude pass over Cuba photographed a Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile being assembled for installation.
Kennedy is in Buffalo. Meanwhile, the Cuban Missile Crisis is about to get underway, and the world doesn't know it yet.
He learned about the photos, the surveillance photos in Cuba, why he was literally here in Buffalo that day.
He was away from the office and away from Washington and still had to do this appearance here while this was all happening.
It wasn't until 2 days later that Kennedy got a full briefing and saw the pictures. But this glorious day in Buffalo began 13 days of behind-the-scenes tension as the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war.
The amazing thing about that famous 13-day period was he had a number of public engagements, including one in Chicago, where he actually kept the engagement because he didn't want to tip off anybody in the news media that this crisis was in front of us.
A crisis obviously averted, and so 54 years later, it's another file within the unknown stories of Western New York.
And finally, as we look ahead to another season of Sabres hockey, the Sabres family has lost a pair of legends. Of course, RJ, Rick Jeanneret, but also back in February, their first PR man, Paul Whelan. So we wrap things up with a look back. I had the honor of talking with Paul about one of the greatest pranks in sports history.
Meet the man behind the myth, the original Sabres PR man, Paul Whelan. The year was 1974. The NHL was worried about player tampering from a competing league called the World Hockey Association. So to keep the WHA from stealing prospects, they changed the draft process.
So they had this draft instead of a regular draft in Montreal where you sat around tables like it is now. They did it by phone.
So each team would get the players selected read to them by league president Clarence Campbell individually over the phone, and then they would make their pick.
You had to sit there for maybe an hour and a half each time waiting for your turn to come.
It was a painstaking process.
And the draft went into 2 days, the phone draft. And remember, it's total boredom because you can't hear anything until your turn comes and they announce the names.
So Whelan and general manager Punch Imlach decided to have a little fun to pass the time.
I said, why don't we draft somebody strange? And Imlach said, what do you mean? I said, well, I don't know. And I said, well, how about a Japanese player?
Yes, they made up a player and a backstory, but first they had to come up with a name.
And I remember Tujimoto Garden Supplies out on Route 16 in Elma.
And that's when Paul Sugimoto's father, Joshua, who owned the store, received an unusual phone call.
My dad called me at the bottom of the stairs for dinner, and as I'm walking down the stairs, he says, hey, I just got a call from the Sabres. And I go, oh, really? What did they want? And he said, well, they wanted to know what a Japanese boy's name was. And then they also wanted to know what the term was for saber.
And so in the 11th round, with the 183rd pick overall,
Imlach goes, the Buffalo Sabres select from the Tokyo Katanas, katana meaning saber, Taro Tujimoto. Well, he had to spell that for Campbell, and that's what we thought was funny. And then we knew that Campbell had to give it to all other teams in the league and had to go through it. Buffalo selects, and they're around Taro, T-A-R-O. All these scouts are looking through their books trying to find a Japanese hockey player.
I thought that was just brilliant. I thought that was funny. It was brilliant.
What happened is that the world bought it.
We're so humbled that our family was part of this whole thing.
And we were carried in the NHL record book as a Taro Tujimoto for many years until they got so tired of answering questions about it in New York that they finally took it out of the NHL official guide.
But it's firmly entrenched in the unknown stories of Western New York as one of the greatest pranks in sports history.
Paul Whelan passed away in February. RJ, of course, in August. Rest in peace to both of them. And with that, I thank you for joining me for another edition of the Unknown Stories of Western New York. I'm Pete Gallivan.